paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today's show is going to be a Q&A from my Patreons. We are going to have more fun than a human should be allowed to have. I took my weekly shower right before the podcast, and I also had my biannual haircut yesterday. Here's a picture of my hairstylist. Through trial and error over the years, at this point, I'd never let a heterosexual cut my hair. So the first question we have is kind of an amalgam from Brendan and Dwayne. When investigating, how do you approach interviewing a new person in an unfamiliar place or in a potentially unsafe environment? Everyone is an individual. You've got to treat every person individually. But then, on the other hand, you have to really understand your environment. I've gone into some very dangerous environments over the years. I spent 3 days in Detroit. I was looking for a Boys Town student who had, I believe, been a victim of a very powerful politician. And I had a lot of information on the kid when he was at Boys Town. And I knew that he moved into King's house after he graduated from Boys Town. So I was very interested in finding him. And I spent 3 days in Detroit, as I said, and I had 9 addresses. He was obviously peripatetic, and I believe that he was a drug addict at that point. And all 9 addresses resulted in zilch. And then I hired a private detective, and he gave me a 10th address, which was in projects in Detroit. And I kind of stuck out in those projects in Detroit. And I was in my car. I'd rented a car. And I saw a kid that was about 15 years old sitting by himself. So I went and sat by him, and we started to talk. And I asked him if he knew the person I was looking for. And he said yes. And I said, well, how about if I buy you lunch and give you $20? Maybe you could introduce me. At that point, I thought it was a fait accompli. I thought for sure I was going to be able to get to talk to this guy. And as I was talking to this kid, 3 gangbangers showed up and said, don't talk to him. He's police. And I said, I'm not police. I'm a writer. I'm from New York. And one of them said, show me your license. So I took up my New York license and I showed it to them. And he then said, show me your writer's license. And I mean, these kids were a little ignorant about some things. And I said, writers really don't have licenses. We write stuff and then we try to sell it. And then he said, now there's 3 of them. And then he said, my uncle is going to be a writer. And he said, you have to have licenses. And usually I try not to inflame a situation, but I was so close with this kid. And I knew that those 3 gangbangers were going to destroy that for me. So I said to the kid, not the kid that I was talking to, but the gangbanger, I said, well, either you're full of shit or your uncle's full of shit. And then the environment got very hostile. And I realized it was a very hot day and these guys were wearing jackets. And I quickly surmised that I could be on the precipice of getting shot. So I said to them, guys, I'm sorry I said that about your uncle, and I'm just going to get back in my car and I'm going to drive away, and you guys will never see me again. Okay. And I got in my car and I drove away, and I didn't go back to those projects because at that point, I believe those projects had become dangerous for me. And oftentimes we go into unsafe environments and we have to keep our cool. That example that I just came up with, I did not keep my cool. I almost invariably keep my cool. I don't know what inspired me to get snippy with that kid, but I got snippy nonetheless. Okay, the next question is, who carried out the suicides of Christopher Bush and Frank Olson? Were they at all connected to mob hitmen? I don't know about Christopher Bush. I've talked about him on a couple of podcasts. He was a child murderer that was connected to the Fox Island Detroit network. And I think that most people believe that he did not kill himself. And the crime scene indicated that he didn't kill himself. It was very sloppy. Now, I don't know who would have killed Christopher Bush in a situation like that, but I believe that that pedophile network had no problems killing people, because I believe that those 4 kids that were killed were probably killed by multiple people, or multiple people knew that they were killed. And I would have to surmise that that network, whoever was in that network, decided that it was time for whom the bells tolled for Christopher Bush. With Frank Olson, I think it's pretty obvious. I think that some CI people pushed him out a window. I mean, I've always thought that. And it was on the 6th floor. And actually, the CIA, I believe, had come out with a report saying that someone needs to fall from the 6th floor to ensure their death. And Frank Olson was, in fact, pushed from the 6th floor. And this is from Matt. I'd love an update, even if it's small, about the owner of the house in Colorado where Paul Benassi was kept. Every Friday, I hope that's going to be talked about. So Charles Crouch, the pedophile that owned that home, sold it to someone who owns a bowling alley in the vicinity. And I've looked into his background. I haven't looked into his background very assiduously, but I've looked into his background, and I haven't found any indications that he's a criminal or involved in criminality, but that doesn't mean anything. He could be, and I just haven't put enough time into it. So Hubert said, one thing that is interesting is Kevin Spacey is all of a sudden back in the media circuit, going on podcasts like Lex Friedman and Piers Morgan, denying that he had any affiliation with Epstein. That's a little problematic because Kevin Spacey was on Jeffrey Epstein's planes. And Kevin Spacey, although he has a history of molesting underage boys, and and Epstein primarily pandered to underage girls, I'm surmising that Kevin Spacey doesn't have very good motives, and that he wants to get back in the acting game. And I got to admit, House of Cards was pretty good, although it didn't incorporate blackmail, which I think is pandemic in our political system. As I've said on the podcast before, last December, federal representative from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, said that his colleagues were getting compromised in honey traps. And I thought that was amazing that a congressman, a federal congressman, would come out and say something like that, but also that it corroborated everything I've been saying for 22 years. I had a buddy who was a editor at a major magazine that's based in New York City. And he would pitch my stories occasionally. And his boss, the editor-in-chief of a major magazine, said that she didn't believe that Epstein was engaged in blackmail. Or I think even that political blackmail didn't even exist. And those are the kind of individuals that we have editing our magazines. They're either very ignorant and they're on a reservation that they don't even know they're on a reservation, or they could be compromised. Is our government as bad as organized crime is our government as bad as the organized crime you research? Well, I think that our government, parts of our government anyway, are definitely organized crime. Going back to our government has engaged in blackmail. Air America, our government has engaged in drug trafficking. Our government has engaged in assassination. And our government facilitates pedophile networks by covering them up. So yes, I think that there is and I'm not saying everybody in the government, but I'm saying that there are some people in the government that are bad news. And unfortunately, they have a lot more power than other people in the government